Tip number 1. Choose your character names carefully. Roald Dahl was particularly good at picking character names because it was clear as soon as you heard them whether they were the goodies or the baddies. For example, take Miss Honey. She was clearly going to be a nice teacher. And Miss Trunchbull, clearly going to be the villain. Other authors have done exactly the same. They've chosen names where it's clear straight away to the reader whether that character is going to be likable or dislikable. Let's look at an example where the character's name will influence how the reader interprets the situation. It was my birthday. Stephen Summers entered the classroom with something hidden behind his back. He approached my table with a grin. Now you're probably thinking that because it's my birthday, Stephen Summers has something nice hidden behind his back for me. But what if his name wasn't Stephen Summers? It was my birthday. Tucker Slug entered the classroom with something hidden behind his back. He approached my table with a grin. That name change has suddenly made it a very different situation. The grin seems less affectionate, more sinister, and I'm not sure I'm looking forward to finding out what is hidden behind his back. Make sure you choose a name that suits the time period that your story is set in. Derek galloped towards the castle, sword drawn. His eyes peered out of the narrow slits of his battered helmet. Inside, sweat poured down his forehead as fear coursed through his veins. A nice little paragraph this, except for one thing, the character name. Derek does not seem like a medieval knight's name. Let's try again, this time with a more medieval-sounding name. Gadwin galloped towards the castle, sword drawn. His eyes peered out of the narrow slits of his battered helmet. Inside, sweat poured down his forehead as fear coursed through his veins. Yes, much better. Make sure your character names fit the country they are from. Let's pretend that I'm writing a story that is set in this village. Peter washed his blistered hands and picked the dirt from beneath his fingernails. He stared at his tired reflection in the mirror. The sun had scorched his skin, and his hair was matted with dust. Hollywood is full of clean, handsome, and debonair heroes, but Peter was far from that. But hero he would become. A very nice paragraph, but I'm wondering if Peter would be a common name in a village like this. Let's try again. Pedro washed his blistered hands and picked the dirt from beneath his fingernails. He stared at his tired reflection in the mirror. The sun had scorched his skin, and his hair was matted with dust. Hollywood is full of clean, handsome, and debonair heroes, but Pedro was far from that. But hero he would become. Changing the name from the English Peter to the Spanish Pedro has suddenly made the story more believable. It feels like our character would come from this village. A technique you might want to try is to use a nickname to tell the reader about your character. He was a dark soul with a complex mind. He went by the name of Virus, although his mother called him by another name, Nicholas. Tip number 2. Avoid writing a police description. When you focus too much on the physical description of your character instead of describing their personality, you can sometimes end up with something that appears to be a police description. Charles was a tall, middle-aged man of average build. He had brown eyes and short, thinning black hair. He was wearing blue jeans, a white shirt and brown shoes. He was carrying a briefcase. Number 3, when you do write a physical description, add an extra detail to make it more interesting. Her fingers were long and slim. Her nails were bitten short, a habit she had got into when she had moved schools. Her hair was dyed white. It was cut so short that it would bring a smile to a sergeant major. Tip number 4. If you have to describe a colour, describe the colour in a way that tells your reader more about the character. He had brown eyes. They were the colour of the coffee that he drank from morning till night. Tip number 5. Describe items of clothing in a way that tells you more about your character's personality. Charlie's shoes were always smeared in mud. If there was a shortcut, he would take it, even if it meant crossing soggy fields. Tommy's trousers were full of pockets, each stuffed with something. He was a walking backpack. Tip number 6. Use objects to tell your reader more about your characters. Under his arm was a newspaper, The Times. He never read it, but it made him feel important as he marched towards the train with all the other businessmen. Around her wrist was a friendship bracelet that she had bought herself on a recent holiday to Greece. It still smelt of the sea air. Tip number 7. Describe your character in motion. Instead of stopping the story, describing them, and then moving on. The robber appeared. He had long, blonde, wiry hair. His eyes were brown and his nose was pointed. His teeth were crooked and more yellow than white. He was tall and had a thin body. His hands were grubby and his nails bitten short. He went in to the bank. As I read that, it felt as if the action had been stopped. A snapshot had been taken of the character, and then that was described before the action moved on. The secret to good description is to be able to describe the character whilst the action is still happening. The robber grabbed the bank store handle with his grubby fingers and twisted. It was late in the day and the bank's safe was bound to be full of money. Was this to be Bones McStab's lucky day? His brown, beady eyes peered around the room. Only one guard on duty and she was dozing. His crooked teeth formed a smile and he nervously scratched his pointy nose. It was now or never. Tip number 8. Don't just focus on what your characters look like. Describe what they smell and sound like. Like most teenagers, his voice hadn't decided which pitch to use, and today it sounded like a badly tuned instrument. Sandy walked with a lightness in her steps, and as she floated along the beach, she left a faint aroma of coconut suntan lotion. Tip number 9. Verb choices can make a big difference, so choose your verbs carefully. Miss Trunchbull stomped into the classroom. Miss Honey floated into the classroom. Mr. Griggs stabbed at his typewriter, and his angry feelings were thumped onto the paper. Mr. Hughes tapped at his keyboard, and the words jumped effortlessly onto the screen.